Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You guys have sent us some really interesting articles and studies lately about job satisfaction, specifically in EMS, and it's a pretty important topic, right? And we're talking about like the factors that make these dedicated professionals think about, maybe leaving this really vital field. So in this deep dive, what we're going to do is really kind of try to pull out those like super key insights from all of this stuff. Give you a clear picture of what the research is saying without you having to like wade through tons and tons of data.
Right. Yeah. And one study in particular that we're going to focus on today is a pretty big one. A survey of over 33,000 nationally certified EMS clinicians from all across the U.S. And it was administered, while they were in the process of recertifying. So this wasn't like just a quick, online poll or something. They used like a legit validated tool. It's called the Spector Job Satisfaction Survey, or JSS. And it's designed to, really get into the nitty-gritty of how people feel about their work.
Right. And just so you know, this particular survey included EMTs, advanced EMTs, which is like the EEMTs, and paramedics. So a good mix of different roles there in pre-hospital care.
Yeah.
They did exclude, people who are primarily in the military and EMRs to really kind of zero in on folks who are like actively involved in direct patient care day in and day out.
So the big question that we're trying to answer for you in this deep dive is, what are the things that make EMS clinicians more or less likely to think about leaving their jobs within the next year, right? Like what makes them want to stick around and what might be pushing them to consider, maybe doing something else?
So to kick things off, let's talk about the big picture findings,
Yeah.
right? Like the overall job satisfaction thing. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because they found that there's a really strong link between how satisfied someone is with their job overall,
Yeah.
and how likely they are to be thinking about leaving EMS.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And so based on like the scores from that JSS, they kind of broke it down into 3 levels of overall satisfaction. So you've got dissatisfied, which is pretty self-explanatory. Then you've got ambivalent, which basically means you're kind of like in the middle, right? Neither really positive nor negative. And then, of course, you've got satisfied. And what's really cool is they actually looked at like the odds of someone leaving based on which of these 3 groups they fell into.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road, right? So what did they find? What were the actual numbers?
Okay, so compared to the folks who are classified as dissatisfied, the clinicians who are in that ambivalent range, remember, they're like kind of neutral, not loving it, not hating it. They were significantly less likely to be thinking about leaving. The odds ratio was only 0.35. And just as a quick reminder, an odds ratio below 1 means there's a lower likelihood of something happening.
So that's a pretty noticeable drop just from being kind of lukewarm about your job, right? But what about the people who are actually, satisfied? What happened to their odds?
Well, for the satisfied group, get this, the odds ratio plummeted to just 0.11. That's tiny. So basically, to put it in plain English, someone who's genuinely happy with their job is way less likely. We're talking like almost 10 times less likely to be thinking about leaving compared to someone who's dissatisfied. So yeah, it's pretty clear that like those positive feelings about work overall have a huge impact on whether someone sticks around.
I mean, that's a massive difference. So yeah, happier EMS folks are much more likely to stay in the field. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, but it's still really cool to see like hard data actually backing that up. But the study didn't stop there. Right? They dug a little deeper into the specific things that contribute to job satisfaction.
Absolutely. And that's one of the great things about the JSS is that it actually breaks down overall job satisfaction into 9 different subscales, right? So it looks at things like, pay, promotion opportunities, the actual nature of the work itself, relationships with coworkers, that sort of thing. And this lets us get like a much more detailed understanding of what's really driving these decisions. For example, pay is pretty obvious, but nature of work, that's talking about like the day-to-day tasks and responsibilities that come with being an EMT or paramedic. Promotion opportunities, that looks at like, whether there's a clear path for moving up in EMS. So you get the idea.
Okay, so out of those 9 specific areas, which ones turned out to be the most strongly connected to whether someone was thinking about leaving EMS? Like, what were the biggies?
So there were 3 subscales where satisfaction really clearly correlated with a lower chance of someone wanting to leave. And the first one, this is probably the most telling one, I think, was the nature of work. The clinicians who said they were satisfied with like the actual tasks, the stuff they were doing day to day, they were way less likely to be thinking about leaving. The odds ratio for that satisfied group was only 0.32. And even the people who are ambivalent about this part of their job, they still showed a lower chance of leaving with an odds ratio of 0.67.
That's really interesting because it kind of suggests that, that the whole point of the job, helping people in emergencies, that's like a really powerful reason for people to stay in EMS, even if other stuff isn't perfect. Like, if they feel good about the work itself, that seems to really matter.
Exactly. It speaks to the intrinsic rewards of being in this profession. Now, the second big factor was pay. And this probably won't come as a surprise to anyone, but satisfaction with how much they were being paid was definitely a big predictor of whether they'd stick around. So those who were satisfied with their pay had an odds ratio of 0.46 for thinking about leaving, and even the ambivalent group was lower with an odds ratio of 0.53. So it just underscores that, fair compensation is huge no matter what field you're in,
Yeah.
and EMS is no different.
Makes total sense. You got to be able to, support yourself and your family. So
Yeah.
we've got nature of work, we've got pay. What was the third one?
All right, the third one that really stood out was promotion opportunities. So the clinicians who felt like there was, a clear path for them to move up in their EMS careers, they were also much less likely to be thinking about leaving. For the satisfied group, the odds ratio was 0.53, and for the ambivalent group, it was 0.69. So this tells us that having that sense of, future potential, like there's room for them to grow professionally, that's a big deal in keeping people engaged and committed to EMS.
Yeah, that makes sense. People want to see a future for themselves in the career path they choose. Makes
Yes.
sense. So those are the top three. What about the other subscales? Like, did any of the other ones show a connection to whether someone was thinking about leaving, even if it wasn't as strong as those top three?
Yes, a few of the others did show a statistically significant connection, though the link wasn't quite as strong. So one of those was contingent rewards, which basically means, how satisfied are you with things like bonuses or special recognition you get for doing a good job? And for both the satisfied and the ambivalent groups, the odds ratio was 0.77 for that one.
So it sounds like those kind of performance-based incentives do play a role,
Yeah.
but maybe not as big of a role as those core things we talked about earlier.
Right, Skydley. Right. And then we also saw that satisfaction with fringe benefits, things like health insurance, paid time off, that sort of thing that had a moderate impact. Odds ratios were 0.87 for the satisfied folks and 0.83 for the ambivalent ones. And then there's supervision, which is about how satisfied people were with, their relationship with their supervisors. So for the satisfied group, that was linked to a lower chance of them wanting to leave with an odds ratio of 0.65. But the interesting thing was, the results for the ambivalent group weren't statistically significant on that one.
That's interesting. So maybe having a good supervisor is really important if you're generally happy with your job already, but if you're kind of unsure about whether you want to stay in EMS, maybe it doesn't matter as much. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, we also saw something similar with communication, which, that's about how satisfied people were with the flow of information within their organization. So again, for the satisfied group, there was a statistically significant link, but it was pretty weak. Odds ratio of 0.87. And just like with supervision, the ambivalent group's result wasn't statistically significant.
Okay, so we've talked about those top three, and then a few others that seem to have some influence. Now, for the really interesting part, were there any areas of job satisfaction that didn't really seem to have a strong link to whether someone wanted to leave? This is where it gets kind of surprising.
Yeah, there were actually a couple of findings that were pretty unexpected. So, for example, satisfaction with operational conditions, which includes things like, having the right equipment, a manageable workload, things like that, that didn't show a statistically significant link to a lower chance of leaving for either the satisfied or the ambivalent groups. In fact, for the satisfied group, the odds ratio was 0.89. So basically, no effect.
That's kind of surprising, right? Because you always hear about, how physically demanding EMS work can be and how sometimes there are issues with resources. Makes you wonder if maybe people in EMS are just so dedicated to what they do that they're willing to put up with some less than ideal conditions.
Yeah, it is surprising. And this next one is maybe even more surprising. They found that satisfaction with coworkers, like how you feel about the people you work with, that also didn't have a significant impact on whether someone was thinking about leaving. The odds ratio for the satisfied group was actually 1.08, which basically means, again, no real effect. And for the ambivalent group, same thing, not statistically significant.
Wow. That's kind of mind-blowing. You'd think that, having good relationships with your fellow EMS professionals, having that camaraderie, being able to support each other, that would be a really big deal. especially in such a high-stress job. But this study suggests that maybe it doesn't play as big of a role in someone's decision to stay in the profession or not as we might think, at least when you're talking about leaving EMS completely.
Yeah, it does. It kind of implies that while having those positive relationships with coworkers is definitely important for your, day-to-day well-being at work, when someone's really thinking about, do I want to stay in this field long term? It might be other things, like the nature of the work, the pay, the opportunities for advancement that really make the difference.
And it's worth noting that this study did take into account, the demographics of the people who responded, just to make sure that those factors weren't kind of skewing the results.
Yeah. Right. So, for example, the median age of the respondents was 36, and the majority were male and white, non-Hispanic. Most of them worked full-time as EMTs in urban settings, and a lot of them worked for fire departments. But the important thing is that they adjusted for all of these demographic and agency characteristics in their statistical analysis. So that
Yeah.
way, they could really isolate the specific impact of job satisfaction on intent to leave.
So thinking about everything we've talked about today, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? Like, what are the most important nuggets of wisdom to remember?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that while overall job satisfaction definitely matters, we saw that really clearly if EMS agencies really want to focus their efforts on keeping people in the field, they should prioritize a few key areas. So number one, make sure that clinicians feel good about the actual work they're doing. Number two, pay them fairly, make sure their compensation reflects the demands and the importance of their work. And number three, create clear pathways for professional growth and advancement. Those seem to be the things that have the biggest impact on retention.
And it's also really interesting to think about the fact that while things like good supervision and good benefits are definitely important for creating a positive work environment, it seems like those things might not be the main drivers of whether someone decides to leave EMS altogether.
Exactly. This research is really valuable because it gives EMS agencies some solid evidence to work with. They can use this information to be more strategic about how they invest their resources and improve retention. It looks like focusing on those core drivers of satisfaction, the work itself, the pay, the potential for growth, that's going to be the most effective way to keep people in EMS.
So to wrap it all up, the big takeaways here are that feeling fulfilled by the work itself, being compensated fairly, and having opportunities to grow in your career. Those things are super strongly linked to whether someone decides to stay in EMS.
Yeah.
And maybe the most surprising finding is that things like, the equipment you have to work with or even your relationships with your coworkers, those things didn't seem to have as much of an impact on people's decision to leave the profession.
Yep, that's a great summary. And this all leads to a really important question. Given everything we've learned today, what do you think are the most effective and, just as importantly, the most realistic things that EMS agencies could do to improve satisfaction in those key areas? The nature of the work, the pay, the promotion opportunities. Think about the impact this could have on the well-being of EMS professionals and ultimately on the quality of emergency care they're able to provide to our communities. It's a big deal.
Absolutely. And hopefully this deep dive has given you all a much clearer and more insightful understanding of what drives job satisfaction and retention in EMS. Thanks for joining us.